Checks with Jennifer. She just got the full collection. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. For members of the public who are in attendance, I'd ask you all please to sign in on the sign-in sheets in the corner. Our public comment period this evening is agendized for the end of the meeting, and we'll use that sign-in sheet to call people up to go ahead and deliver your public comments at the conclusion of the meeting based on folks who've identified that they'd like to address the GPAC with an X in that box on the sign-in sheet. If you haven't done that yet, you'll still be able to address the GPAC. I just want to use that as a way of kind of keeping the public comment period rolling along and orderly at the end of our meeting. Okay, with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jeff Henderson, and I am the project manager for the General Plan Update with the PMC team. With me this evening is Chris Reed. Chris is going to be helping me out. He's also with PMC. He's going to be helping me out by taking our notes this evening. City staff present this evening includes Jennifer Villasenor and Scott Hess. Any other city staff present?
No, but can we switch the agenda a little bit? Just like
let's do it. Sure.
So everybody on the GPAC got one of these folders, and it has just a couple of bits of information that I wanted to share with you guys and basically help you understand why we provided it. The first part is a memo, and these are also available. Copies of the memo are available for the public at the table in the back. But this just addresses some of the questions that we received at the last GPAC meeting, and so I thought that we thought by providing it for you would help you understand it, and if you have additional questions, you can always ask us. And then the two attachments are specifically related to the questions that were asked here again regarding the required state mandated elements and then the optional elements. And then it gives references, the writer gives references to the State of California General Plan guidelines, which talks about the requirements of a general plan, etc. And then we provided 2 slides from our recent City Council PowerPoint, and the reason for this is because just as we've been managing the project and the kinds of questions that we get, we wanted to make sure that the GPAC had the information necessary so that as you may get questions around town, or if you have questions yourself, they're here. One talks about what this general plan update is doing, just some key bullet points. And then the second one, the second part of that slide is the project budget. We've also received questions about that as well. And then we provided 2 other bits of information. One was a question that was requested by a GPAC member, was information on the RHNA, which is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So we provided 2 pages from the housing element. The first page is what state law requires and how the RHNA comes down from SCAG and then to the city. And then the second page is the page that talks about how the city's existing zoning and the sites within the city can accommodate the RHNA that we were given by SCAG. And so if anybody has questions on that, you can always ask them. You can contact me directly to talk about that. But this was part of our housing element. It's currently in the housing on the city's website, and it was adopted back in 2013.
Can I ask you a question? You can answer it later.
Sure.
Okay. Where is it in either the allocation that we get or state law that says that we can't, the city can't get credit for converting an existing apartment complex to make it affordable, or to take a mobile home park, for instance?
We can for existing, but it has to be very certain criteria for rehab projects. So we can do like an acquisition rehab where we as a city acquire, or we help an affordable housing developer acquire and then rehabilitate a project for affordability, like a market rate.
Well, I'm thinking more, and I don't go beyond what I said I would. I'm thinking more like the subsidy, a rental subsidy, or some subsidy that maybe would provided to someone already living in it who is eligible for.
Yeah, we don't get credit for that towards our RENA.
But I mean, I'm trying to find out what specifically do they say? Because I think we ought to change it. Beside the point.
I mean, what specifically does the state,
Yeah.
like housing element
Yeah,
law?
how do they state that? Where is it? Could you get me that information?
Sure, yeah.
That's good enough.
Yeah, but they don't let us get credit, but we have a program where we get credit for implementing that program, but we don't get credit towards the RENA. So there's two different things.
Yeah. Why don't you talk to me?
No problem.
Thank you.
Jennifer, can the alternates get a copy of what you distributed to?
Yeah, sure, brought some extras for the alternates.
Thank you.
And then the last thing is another information request from the GPAC, one of the GPAC members. And this was just taking all the existing issues from the general plan. For some people, it may help you. For some people, you don't necessarily need it. But it's how it translates, compares to the memo that you received. So if you have any questions on that, feel free. If you want me to email that to you, I can too. And then finally, the last two bits of information is a fact sheet that we provided at the planning counter. We passed it out at Surf City Nights and other places. We've had it at the pop-up workshops, and it gives information about the general plan project, and on the back, it gives demographics about the city. And then the last flyer is something we've had at the planning counter, and this just gives information about the project website. So if you get questions again, you can direct people to it. And it talks about some of the information that's on the project website. We are updating that as well. So that's everything that's in the packet. And then I'll turn it back over to Jeff unless you guys have any questions.
Any clarification questions on behalf of the GPAC or alternates about the contents of the package?
Yeah, on Measure M, I think that's the only thing that it looks like there's a monetary loss if we don't do it. What is that monetary loss?
Since that's my memo, I'll respond to that.
Am I right to say that's the only monetary loss?
In 1996, when we adopted the growth management element, we needed to in order to get Measure M funds.
Right.
Things have changed in 20 years, so we may not have to do a growth management element. We're going to look at that.
Okay.
That's what was done in 1996.
Right.
So one of the objectives on the other slide is we're going to look at consolidating some of the elements. Do we need all 16 of them?
And there was no other penalties besides that?
No,
And
for growth
for
management.
for any of this stuff. I mean, it looked like you explained it, but that was the only one I saw that had any money attached to it. Indirect money, yeah. Well, like the housing element, what if we don't comply with that? What happens?
You don't get any penalties or fines.
Right. What happens? That's what I was looking for.
Right. There's no
Go
penalties
to
or
court,
fines.
and the judge will order you not to issue any building permits.
Yeah,
That's what I want to know.
what HCD
Right.
is doing, if cities don't adopt the housing element, is that they're litigating against them, and it would prevent the city from issuing any building permits.
So like Seal Beach?
Yeah, so in the 90s, San Bernardino
Okay.
had to update their general plan and couldn't issue building permits until they got it updated. And Seal Beach had happened in the 80s, I think, same thing. So.
You basically just keep yourself open to litigation from the state or from anybody
Advocacy
really.
groups, right.
Yeah, that will litigate you either for not having an adequate general plan or an adequate housing element, let's say. And then you the converse to that is even though there's no penalty or fine, you become not eligible for funding when it does become available from the state for certain either housing projects or park projects or acquisition or road or street projects.
Yeah, that was the
Yeah.
original concern with it is what financial problems are, what are the.
Right, so
What
Measure
happens?
M was the one.
Okay.
The other thing that's written in the memo real quick is that all land use decisions and some of the decisions Jennifer mentioned rely on the framework of the general plan. So if that information is outdated, like last time we did this was in 96, then that could open up the city to legal challenge. And so all land use decisions that the planning commission makes and the city council makes depend on and rely on the information in the general plan.
And Eric, there's another sort of layer too, in that while there's not a penalty, let's say, for not doing it, you don't, other than the funding that becomes available, you also can take advantage of like streamline. They put it in the CEQA that if you have an adequate general plan and it addresses.
Right, it streamlines that process.
It streamlines that process, and then, let's say, then we're sort of like not competitive, let's say, with other cities that may have those where people are looking to move into town, let's say, whether it be a business or a development project or whatever. It just doesn't position the city, I think, well for that. But to answer the question correctly, there's no penalties.
Thank you.
Okay, any further clarification questions? Okay, hearing none, we'll go ahead and review our agenda for this evening. We've sort of done the welcome. I was going to ask Jennifer to also take a few minutes to summarize where we're at with the general plan update project, some of the things that have gone on over the summer, and what we have planned for the rest of the year. And then we're going to continue our review and discussion of the key issues memo that we worked our way most of the way through last time. I believe we have 5, maybe 6 key issues left to discuss, and we'll visit those and have similar discussion to what we did at our previous meeting on those 5 or 6 issues. And then we have our another period for discussion. There's a handful of questions that GPAC members have brought to the table that are not necessarily directly related to the general plan, but yet of broader planning interest. And we'll have a period of time for some dialogue between GPAC members, alternates, and staff regarding those questions. Approximately 7:35, maybe earlier if we're moving quicker through the other agenda items. We'll open up for public comments, similar to how we did at our previous meeting. Again, members of the public, I'd ask everyone to please ensure that you've signed in on the sign-in sheet. We'll use that to ask people to come forward and address the GPAC at that time. And then at roughly 8 o'clock this evening, we'll adjourn. Okay. Jennifer, you want to talk a little bit about where we're at with the project status?
Sure, and I'll keep it brief since we just met about a month ago. Since our last meeting, the really sort of biggest thing that's occurred is we've had our first study session with the city council. And what we brought forward to them was really I call it the final draft vision, because it reflects all of the work that the GPAC did in terms of refining the vision statement and prioritizing the guiding principles. So we discussed that with the city council, and then we talked about, we gave them an overview of the project as well. In terms of what else we've been doing with the project is we've just been finalizing. We haven't had any task force meetings. We've just been finalizing and moving forward with working on and completing the technical studies for the technical background report. After this meeting, we probably won't meet again until January. So we'll take some more time, try to get most of the technical reports out of the way. We'll do 1 or 2 task force meetings that we have scheduled, and then we'll pick back up again in January.
And that transition will essentially be between this community vision phase that we're sort of closing out, as Jennifer mentioned, with presentation to the council. And I shouldn't say completely closing out. That vision is open until the end of the general plan process. But it's a draft that is of sufficient form for us to begin to move forward with some of the other questions to address, including the issues that we've been addressing in our previous meeting and this one. As we go forward into January, then we'll be working on goals and policies, as well as potential alternative approaches to addressing some of the key issues. And so that'll be really part of our early work in 2015 that then leads us into the administrative draft and draft versions of the various documents, namely the general plan, the sustainability action plan, and the EIR. And all along the way, there will be continued community engagement. We'll renew the rounds of pop-up workshops, the successful one that we've had at the Easter egg hunt, for example. And we're going to be trying a lot of the other techniques. We've been very open to the ideas that the council, the commission, the GPAC, and the community at large are brought to the table to help better engage the community. So that'll be going on as well as we get into 2015 and 2016. Okay, let's talk now about the key issues memorandum. I just have a couple of slides that are a refresher from our previous meeting, or this may be new information for those who were not able to be present last time. What we're talking about in this sequence of meetings are what we've referred to as key issues. So we've already looked at the vision, which is that sort of long-range, 30-year perspective of what the community has indicated that it would like to become in 2040. Then from that vision level, we begin to organize ourselves into the chapters or elements of the plan. And for the time being, we're moving forward with the issues that have been identified in the existing general plan. Part of the dialogue that we're having is helping us to reconsider that format and determine if we can indeed move forward with a more streamlined general plan with fewer elements and less redundancy. And so that's something that we're certainly working toward, as Scott has indicated, and as we've talked about through some of the questions and answers. We're now wrestling with these issues that have been identified in this memo. In large part, they're based on the issues from the existing general plan. This document that Jennifer had mentioned earlier is essentially a compilation of the issues on the actual pages of the existing general plan, and we've gone through and essentially marked where, for example, on the first page of this, 2 land use issues have been consolidated into 1. And you can follow that logic all the way through that workbook. So in part, it's based on the existing general plan and other city policies that are of such a form that they could rise to the general plan level. They're also based in part on what we're learning through the very early drafts of the technical studies. They're based in part on the community engagement findings that we've discussed in previous meetings and the community themes that were developed at the very beginning of the program through stakeholder interviews. What we do with this information ultimately is move it into the general plan and then develop goals, policies, and actions for these 3 subsequent steps to address how we deal with these issues. So you'll recall a lot of our dialogue at the previous meeting was based on, we're looking at this point for what are the issues, then we're going to turn around and say what are the solutions. And so at this point, we're still at that stage of asking the basic question, is this something important enough that it should rise to the level of being addressed in the city's primary land use and conservation policy document? And will it be important now and for the next 20 years? And so that's really the questions that we're asking in the way that we'd like to discuss these issues. They're identified, as I said, using the existing chapters and elements of the plan, and some of them are interrelated and overlap more than one of the elements. And that's just based on the inherent nature of the general plan to be interrelated. A number of new issues have been introduced, as well as some of the existing ones being updated as they're ongoing as we learn more about them. In many cases, as you can see in the document that Jennifer's distributed, we've taken multiple issues and consolidated them into much broader statements. There are some of these issues, for example, that essentially say, I think there's one in there that essentially says, the city needs to purchase land at a specific location. That's a solution. And what we really want to get behind is, on that question, is why at that time did the city consider that it needed to purchase land at a specific location? It's that why that we're at right now. In order to avoid having issues at that broad level in the general plan that say, go do this right now. That's more what you want in a policy or an action down the road. So we've also attempted to reduce the duplication across the elements, as was the case with the guiding principles when you first saw them. There's no priority implied by the order that they're presented here, and they're going to be rearranged as the plan is further organized. The elements that we're not considering, because they're parts of separate processes, run from the range of the housing element, which, as Jennifer indicated, has already been adopted and is in place for the next 8-year cycle. The historic and cultural resources element, which is being considered separately by the city's Allied Arts Board, and the coastal element, which the city is going to update after the rest of the general plan is updated. That coastal element relates primarily to the city's local coastal program, which is a document required by the Coastal Commission that the city is elected to update after the broader general plan update is completed. And as Scott mentioned, the growth management element is a little bit of a different beast. It addresses issues that are cross-referenced throughout all of the general plan. And we're going to be further reevaluating the need for that element in light of potential revisions or recent revisions to Measure M. So, just a bit of progress. The elements that we've updated, that we've addressed at the issue level in the previous meeting run from land use all the way through to air quality. We're picking up tonight with environmental hazards, noise, and hazardous materials, and we highlighted previously the 3 elements that we're not addressing the issues for at this time. And again, I want to run back to the key questions that we're trying to address in these discussions. 1, is this important enough that it should be addressed in the general plan? 2, is anything missing when you consider a topic? So for example, tonight we're going to talk about hazards, and this usually runs the range from seismic hazards to flooding, emergency response, those types of issues. As you look at the range of issues that we presented, is anything missing in your mind? Because this is the time we want to get those down and address them as we're moving forward. Okay, any questions before we begin again? Okay. Then as we proceeded last time, and I'm now moving to page 16 of the key issues memo, which is the beginning of the hazards chapter. There are 3 issues that are presented in the discussion of key issues for the hazards chapter. 1, preparing for a potentially changing coastline. 2, minimizing flooding and tsunami hazards. And 3, reducing damage from long-term ponding. And there we're referring to stuff that isn't necessarily a flood event, but just recurring ponding that occurs in different locations throughout the city. We're aware that this is a particular issue down along portions of PCH. So these are 3 issues that are presented here. Any topics that the GPAC would like to begin on discussion? And since we only have 5 tonight, I think we do have the luxury of taking each one individually if you'd like to. Dan?
Hello. Thanks for everybody showing up again. In the preamble, you mentioned that SAGE, which I had to go look up. It's not a common word. Is that something we have a problem with in town? It seems to be more fixed bodies of water.
Right. That will typically happen with fixed bodies of water or reservoirs.
Okay.
And for everybody's knowledge, a SAGE is essentially when you have an earthquake and you have a water body, the water essentially swishes in it like a bathtub and has the potential to overtop either side of that, which can lead to potential damage. So it's something that is triggered immediately by an earthquake. And it is one of the hazards we're specifically required to address under state law. So it may not be a locally relevant hazard, but we have to essentially show that we have considered and addressed it pursuant to state law.
Then I have 4 add-on, or 3 add-on ones. One is the high-pressure gas lines that went across the fault. I don't know if that gets covered in earthquake.
This would be the place to
The
address it.
seismic stuff, yeah, something. I mean, that's an issue that we possibly have. All the pipelines that are running underground that possibly cause fault lines, and I probably will get hashed out during the seismic evaluation
Yes.
stuff. And then we consistently had some oil discharge into our channels, and that seemingly is costing fire department resources and other resources, where I'd say every quarter or so we get there's message popped up that says there was some sort of oil that got discharged in there. That's something to look at. And then our urban wildlife interface problem that we're having with coyotes. I don't know if that's an environmental hazard or an environmental section, but that's becoming more and more of an issue that in here and also neighboring cities.
So human-wildlife interaction.
Yeah, exactly, where that may become, going in the future as we start building out more and more of the areas, and our sister cities are building out more and more of their areas, so that's going to push some of that in there. So I don't know if that's something that needs to get addressed, but it's in a specific section, but I think it does rise to the level of the general plan.
And I want to back up, and I think you raise a good point that's helpful for explanation at large. There's 3 issues here. There's 3 issues here, but this particular topic hazards runs a range. You don't see earthquake issues here, for example. Part of the reason for that is, and when you look at this list, you're going to see a much, much longer list of issues. Part of the reason for that is the city has ways of addressing those issues that don't necessarily require separate general plan policy. The building code, for example. The building code has seismic safety provisions for new buildings. If you comply with that, it essentially addresses the problem to the point that it needs to be addressed at the city level. And the general plan can and should and will have maps of faults and seismic hazard areas, landslides, liquefaction, fault rupture, and the like. But the way the city addresses that is essentially by complying with existing law. The general plan does not have to spend a lot of time talking about, we have this fault. It has the potential to create a certain level of earthquake event. And the way of addressing that is complying with the building code. That's it. That's all you really have to say. And so it doesn't really rise to the level of an issue for discussion of the GPAC saying, well, is there another way we should deal with this besides complying with the building? Not really. So what we've dealt with here are really the three that we feel are the best places to potentially address these hazards primarily through general plan policy as opposed to just relying on state law, because these are areas where state law is either nebulous or hasn't essentially provided a prescriptive way for the city to deal with. So it's a long-winded way of essentially saying there are more hazards issues than what you see here, and we've accounted for that, and we have a way of addressing in the general plan that's primarily through compliance with existing law. This is really the representation of what the group could most productively discuss and address to provide policy guidance in the absence of such things. Mark.
One aspect to number 3 on ponding, the text catches it in terms of precipitation not percolating down fast enough, but we've had a few high groundwater events that have occurred during otherwise dry times of year, where surface ponding will suddenly come from above, and it would cause seepage in certain residential areas, and the city has had to increase groundwater pumping to try and mitigate for some of those issues, and so that scenario wasn't captured in that text.
Right, and we've actually talked at length with the Sea Level Rise Task Force about that issue, and we can move that discussion into the body of the text for this.
Where does the groundwater contamination or the aquifer come in? Is that environmental or is that in some other section?
That should be an environmental. Let me see if we did address that there. I think we can certainly raise it now, and we can put it back in the environmental issue. That would be the place to do it.
Specifically, it would be like, there's this whole, I don't want to get into the technical, but pretty soon they're going to do fracking and, injecting water and other chemicals in to extract the oil. We have a lot of oil, and I think that's at least it's rising to an issue now, and the state's saying, I think the cities, need to take control of that. So I just wanted to see if we had considered that, or where would that be, but it might be an environmental hazard, at least groundwater contamination, because we need our aquifer here in the city.
Okay, yeah, I recall from our previous meeting a discussion to introduce a new water quality issue. And that's something we've actually summarized in the meeting notes from that meeting. And I think that would be the place for us to tackle that. But that would be the appropriate place to put that. And Chris is taking those notes and making sure to make sure that that's there. Okay, any other general questions?
Number one.
Number one.
Question. Explain it.
Okay.
I mean, I've lived here forever. The coast hasn't changed yet, but I know people think it's going to. Mr. Bixby, that it's going to change.
What do you mean it hasn't changed? It's absolutely changed.
It has not changed.
You have to truck sand on one side or the other.
But
let's let Eric finish.
What exactly is the hazard, and is it keeping our coast? I mean, what's it there for, and how do you protect something like that? Well, I mean, what are your thoughts on protecting something like that?
Right. As we understand it, there are a variety of different scenarios that have been considered. A lot of this information is analyzed at the state level, but there's a variety of different scenarios that have been considered addressing levels to which the sea may rise between now and 2039 and between 2039 and 2090. 2 different scenarios have been analyzed. And they've been analyzed from a very conservative perspective, what if only a little bit of change happens, all the way through to almost a catastrophic perspective. And for all purposes, in what we're considering related to the general plan, we're sticking with the extreme conservative scenario. And even under that scenario, there are potential impacts to both the coastal areas, and here we're talking primarily the beach and the areas leading to the ocean from the beach. And then there are some inland potential impacts in the areas where, kind of between the mesas, where potential seawater could run up. We're not talking about kind of the coastline necessarily permanently moving to a new location. This is not beachfront property in Palm Springs that we're talking about. We're talking about potential when there's a major storm event the results of that event are worse because of the fact that you've got increased storm surge, and those are primarily going to affect more of the inland areas. So we've divided this into both coastal impacts and potential inland impacts.
So is this planning for storms, sir? That's what I'm trying to
Yes.
figure out. So
Yeah, the
back in
primary
the
risk-
80s when PCH was underwater, right? We're looking at that as how to clean that up quick,
Yeah.
how to.
Yeah, the primary risks are from storm surge, and the primary assets at risk are things like PCH. And PCH itself, some of the other infrastructure in the coastal area, and really what we're trying to consider are what are the prolonged effects on that infrastructure should it spend more time inundated? That's the primary question that we're considering with regard to infrastructure in the coastal area. So I think
I see how you're doing that, but you're saying preparing for it. So are you just studying PCH is underwater for 3 months like it was before? What impact is that going to have? Is that what you're talking about?
It would be starting there and then considering the potential impacts of change in scenarios. What happens if it gets worse? And ultimately what we're looking at are what's the infrastructure in place? What are the other city investments that have been made? Are there other public safety facilities and the like that are in areas that could be potentially affected more often or more substantially? And ultimately, what are the populations in those areas, particularly for the inland analysis? You know, what's the potential effect on property and people of potentially spending more time in an inundated state in some of those areas? Those are the basic questions that we're analyzing. The technical study is still underway, and that's something that we look to have completed by the end of the year, at which point we'll have data to be able to consider and analyze those solutions. So again, here at this point, we're talking about the issue. And is this an issue that's relevant to the general plan, such that it should be considered at the stage where we're formulating policies, alternatives, and solutions? Dick?
Is that something that we do, or does the task force have the primary responsibility? Is there a task force?
The task force is considering this question almost as its sole purpose.
So we
it's
get
to
there.
bring those recommendations ultimately to the GPAC. Right. But they're going to really be beginning to look at those solutions. I think at this point we're looking for confirmation potentially at the GPAC level as to whether this is something that should be addressed at a policy level.
What about residential runoff as a subject? I know you see drains are labeled and things like that, but capturing that which leads directly into the oceans is residential and even business runoff a hazard that we need to manage.
That's something we've addressed probably more in an infrastructure capacity, storm drain infrastructure, as well as in this new water quality issue that we're addressing. So yeah,
But you are doing a study for it.
Yes, and we have a whole separate technical study for urban runoff. And in fact, are proposing a number of revisions to the comprehensive urban runoff master plan.
So that includes water quality.
Yeah, that will address water quality. Okay, any other discussion of House 1? I mean, just with our limited number of issues here, I think we could probably take these sequentially tonight.
Just to bring it up, it's sort of the elephant in the room. The first sentence under House 1, where it ends in due to sea level rise, I think there's some folks within the community and within this group that are uncomfortable with that language. Is there a way that language could be modified that it isn't specifically sea level rise, if it's sea level rise due to storm surges? When you say it as broadly as sea level rise, I think people will look at it in two different ways. And if it could be identified a little bit more specifically.
So maybe getting beyond just it's sea level rise to it's storm surge, it's inundation, it's inland, it's coastal. And
I think
kind
that
of
would
breaking
be
it down.
helpful, yes.
But
That's helpful.
is the question though, if the sea level rise, as small as it may be because of global warming, whatever the issue are, but if the sea level rise is slight, those storm surges happen more often than just in 1980 where the average sea level is lower and it takes a much larger storm surge before damage occurs. So is there a combination between the verbiage, because sea level rise is an issue across the the globe if in fact it's happening. And it happens in cycles, so whatever the cause is irrelevant, but you gotta deal with it. Venice has to deal with it in Italy, we may have to deal with it if, 1 inch sea rise causes more storm damage from medium storms versus very large storms. So I mean, the language I think has to be appropriate. Nobody's predicting storm rise. Nobody's saying that you're predicting the rise of sea, but you have to be prepared for it to happen.
Right, there's a scenario under which the sea could rise, under the scenario that you've mentioned. The scenario's there. Under the scenario, what does the city do? And I think that may be kind of what I'm hearing would be more acceptable level of language is consider the scenario. Should the scenario arise, here's the plan.
Well, does the plan have to take into consideration gradients? Like you said, we're not talking about waterfront property in Palm Springs. 1 inch sea rise, which everybody say, who cares, has effect on how many more storms actually cause damage than before the 1 inch sea rise. 1 inch doesn't affect us on a day-to-day basis. As an example, so maybe there's gradients of, extreme, a foot rise, 2 foot, 3 foot rise versus a 6 inch rise.
Right. And this is precisely the information the task force is considering. And the task force is seeing multiple scenarios too. They're seeing multiple timeframes and multiple scenarios. This is what's going to come forward. What we will be working on ultimately is what's the planning scenario. Given all this data, great, what are we planning for?
Yeah.
And therefore,
And that's what my concern. I mean, I plan for storms, plan for whatever. But what is it? Is this going to go into building? Is it going to be if someone in Sunset Beach decides to rip down their house and build, we're going to make them build a certain way because we put this policy in place, like they do in Florida for storm surge, where they're on stilts? That's what I'm concerned. Is it going to change building practices, or is it how do you prepare for something? A seawall? What? You definitely want your pump infrastructure and everything ready to handle storms and surges and what. We get them if you lived here, you go down to Seal Beach and walk the underside of your car a couple times a year, Sunset Beach. But and we want all that working, but how far does it go?
the tools available to you essentially remain the same tools you use to address storm surge and flooding. It's elevation, site planning, potentially relocation, depending on the degree of the severity of the hazard and ultimately the level to which the city wants to commit to addressing that. So I want to be clear, we're not prescribing any solution, particularly not at this point. What we're doing is
But by preparing, you have a prescription coming.
yes, there's a prescription coming.
Right.
But that prescription is through the dialogue that occurs at the task force, the GPAC, and we're not proposing any particular prescription now. What we're doing now is saying, hey, is this important enough that we need to continue having this conversation?
And to get to your point about if a house is torn down and rebuilt, you still have to build a house above the base flood elevation if it's a total tear down. And that's not city, that's federal. That's federal code. So that is totally outside of our realm.
I just don't know if we're going further.
And you bring up
further.
I get you.
You bring up an interesting point, which is, I think it kind of gets to what I was saying before. There aren't federal requirements for dealing with this right now. There are very few state requirements for dealing with this. There are some because you're in the coastal zone and the California Coastal Commission has made sea level rise a top priority. So your LCP your local coastal program is going to have to address these matters. We're trying to deal with it at a general plan level so that there's good guidance for doing that in your LCP down the road. But this is because of the presence in the coastal zone. The Coastal Commission is going to be very interested in the city's approach to addressing sea level rise. But I think I do want to conclude that summary on the point that I made earlier for Eric, which is I think the tools that you have at your disposal are the tools that you're already using. It may just be that they apply to a bigger area or a more frequent period of time. But there's no dramatic shift, I think, in the types of tools that you may begin to use. The question is where you would apply it.
Just be sure you come to every meeting. You won't miss anything. You won't miss it.
Okay, any other discussion on HAZ 1? And if not, let's go to HAZ 2, minimizing flooding and tsunami hazards. These are your two, I think of the of the potential environmental hazards other than earthquakes, which we talked about are largely regulated through building codes and other state provisions that already exist, flooding and tsunami are two of the really key hazard issues that affect Huntington Beach. And we're aware there's a variety of different studies that have been going on, particularly relative to tsunamis. The city's a participant in some statewide studies that are going on to help really protect more people by incorporating better tsunami warning systems and getting better mapping of the areas that may be affected by tsunami. Those are things we're aware of that we'll be addressing in the general plan update as well. So any discussion on flooding and tsunamis?
Yes. Prior to May of this year, I believe it was, FEMA had some language for flood zones. And there were some great parts of Huntington Beach that were below sea level. And they would be required to carry unsustainable premiums on their flood insurance. I'm an insurance agent. And so I know this. And the concern I have is that at some future time, if some of those rules that were retracted come back into play, it could really depress a real estate market for those areas that have this unmanageable flood insurance premiums. What are we going to do with those? I think we need to be looking outward and down the road for that kind of a concern, that the costs of adhering to federal rules for mortgages and things like that, it'll make some homes unsellable. And that could be a real problem as far as creating some blighted neighborhoods. And I think that's something that should be considered.
Well, that also gets back into the suite of tools that we can deploy to address some of these things. Smart deployment of some of those tools in the longer range period could avoid the impacts that you speak of, because you would no longer have that same level of risk if we did deploy those tools.
The only thing is, if the base flood elevation has been determined and the home is built below it, no matter how much you have that you're going to suck the water out of that neighborhood, it's still going to have a risk that the federal government's going to require people to have insurance or deal with it.
But we can apply for changes in base flood elevations based on flood improvements, such as the storm channels and what have you.
True.
It sounds like there's a good issue emerging here.
Yeah, it's a potential risk from a great area of our community that I think we need to be farsighted about, personally.
Good, thanks, Diane. Other thoughts on HAZ 2? Okay, how about HAZ 3, long-term ponding? We had the discussion earlier about adding some additional discussion to this from other aspects of the project. Anything else on that? If not, so this last slide combines the last two sections, noise and hazardous materials. And again, as was the case with the hazards, these are pretty thin sections on the issues discussion, because so many of these issues, particularly when you start dealing with hazardous materials, are addressed by federal and state law. And the city's obligated to comply with that, and that addresses where these things occur in the built environment for the most part. The same is true to some regard with noise, although that's more locally regulated under the city's noise ordinance. But the primary issue with noise is really, how do you mitigate noise from new development? What are the ways that what are the options the city has to do that, and how important of an issue is that? I should state, noise, I should remind everybody, is a required general plan element. Has been, I believe, since the late 60s. And it's in large part considered a public health and safety issue. And jurisdictions tend to set noise standards at a general plan level to identify acceptable noise levels for different land use types and where those land use types occur in either urban or rural environments. The city has the option of taking additional steps, and does take additional steps, to regulate things like nuisance noise, loud parties, barking dogs, that kind of a thing, and can take steps to take more aggressive standards and to employ more aggressive standards than those that are recommended in the state general plan guidelines. So those are just some things to consider in the context of the larger noise issue. And we've kind of isolated this to noise from new development. This would be potentially infill development, potentially development of vacant lots near residential areas, and ways to consider land use choices relative to the potential potential noise that they may create.
Thoughts
on noise? I'll come to Dick and then over to you.
Oh,
Okay,
go
thanks.
ahead. Somebody else have a comment?
I do. This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart, having dealt with a business that was excessively noisy. So I was a little concerned on this issue. There are different levels that are acceptable when it comes to noise, depending on what type of business it is, what type of area it is, if it's industrial versus residential and so forth. And in this city, we have areas that bleed. So it's not uncommon to have residential adjacent to industrial. So in this, I wasn't really concerned, what are we really focusing on? You mentioned it's new development. Are we talking about new apartments that are going up? Are we talking about the excessive noise that's going to be generated from building that particular apartment? I mean, so where are we going with this? Are we talking about construction hours or business hours? Or, so to me, this whole issue is very vague. The city, I know, has a noise ordinance already in place. So are we looking to modify that or enhance it?
I think the primary question in front of us is to essentially affirm the city's existing noise standards in the context of the general plan or explore changing them. And that's the basic choice in front of us. And the considerations you would want to have in making that choice are, what are the potential health impacts on surrounding, if it's an industrial use or a commercial use or a residential area, what are the potential health impacts of making a change? On the other hand, I think you'd also want to consider the potential impacts of transportation use. Noise coming from roadways or railways or other transportation facilities in the city. Air noise associated with the air station in Seal Beach. These are the considerations that we have in front of us. So I think the basic question is whether you would entertain a change to the noise standards, whether there's any reason to do that. So I mean, that's the basic issue. Again, noise is a general plan requirement. I think we've always sort of, in practice, have always kind of considered it as the main issue is the standards and whether the standards are working. And if the standards are working, is there a need to adjust them at all? If they're not working, then we probably need to take a look at it and consider adjustments. Mark.
So I want to echo everything she has just said, and I wanted to point out that the text as written currently in N1 seems to be focused exclusively on vehicular noise and doesn't seem to address the land use and compatibility type situations or intensifications of existing uses.
Got it. Let's add a land use intensity issue. That's typically a parallel issue to the transportation noise.
Now, a lot of the noise, you mentioned transportation, I think that's a good idea. It really has to do with the amount of traffic, the surface that's on the street. If you let a street go and you eliminate the smooth surface and you get into where it's grainier, it just makes a lot more noise and traffic speed. So, I don't think the city really takes that into consideration. They're more interested in the speed for traffic hazard as opposed to noise, quiet.
Right, and you have the ability to essentially manipulate any one of those things and achieve a noise reduction.
But I would think that should play an important part in speed control.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts on the noise issue or related noise issues? Okay, hearing none. Our final issue, remediating brownfield sites. This is an interesting consideration, I think, in Huntington Beach, just because I think there have certainly been brownfields in previous general plan cycles, but I think we're hitting a point where a lot of the construction in the sort of post-World War II period is hitting that point now where you've got some areas with real potential that are brownfields. And one of the interesting questions that we can address in the general plan is future uses. And so I think this is going to be an area of considerable discussion as we go through into land use alternatives, but wanted to just get your general perspectives and comments on remediating brownfield sites as is presented here.
And brownfield sites,
You're gonna identify the Ascot site and a few other sites that have been abandoned. Basically, it's not economical to go in and do anything.
All sorts of comments.
Right, I mean, and just for everybody's knowledge, a brownfield site, when we refer to it in that context, we're essentially referring to a site that's historically been industrial, may have a certain level of contamination, needs remediation, and after remediation may be available for another use. So that's that cycle from moving from industrial to, essentially not really productive as an industrial use anymore, and if the site's remediated, you can broaden the range of uses for that site. So the real questions are retain those as industrial or remediate them. And the remediation cost would be borne probably primarily by the property owner. But would the city's policy ultimately be to support remediation of those sites and then future use as other potential names?
I just wanted to piggyback on what Dick thought. That was my point exactly, is there are sites within the city that I've spoken to developers about, and it's just cost prohibitive to clean it up. I would love to see if there was an opportunity that the city could do some sort of joint venture with these developers to clean up some of these areas. One of the prime locations is just down the street from us at Gothard and Garfield, and that unfortunately cannot be developed. It's just cost prohibitive. It'd be, I think, a great opportunity for the city if we could, if it was affordable, to encourage that type of development.
The city has some pretty good requirements or standards for mitigating any contamination to the fire department. So it's probably one of those deals where we just said we already have something on the books to do it, but maybe it's well to have in the general plan where the sites are.
Identify the site.
Yeah, just to identify the site, I don't know a little more.
And I think that's about the level the general plan, at least at the policy level,
Yeah.
would go.
Yeah.
As you move to the action level, sort of what do you do with your policy, you've got some options. And, the types of programs that the other member was mentioning are options, but they're options. And I think, you're correct, that what the general plan can do is say, hey, this is out there. It's here, and here are some potential priorities for the future. And then you ultimately wind up with programs that say, okay, pick up that potential priority and run with it for the next 5 years. So that's really how the general plan fits together on an issue like this. Okay, any other discussion on brownfield sites? Important enough issue to carry forward and start to essentially map them and look at some alternatives.
Huntington Beach has a standard that's higher than any other city in Orange County or higher than the county itself. So maybe they ought to take a realistic look at, what you really need. It is just going too high. And is that making it too difficult to develop or too recycled? So
On the one hand, it may be funding, on the other hand, it may be standards.
I can recall one project that they said, oh my God, there's arsenic on the site. But to find out that all this property, all of Huntington Beach has a high level of arsenic because of the arsenic kind of moving down out of the surrounding mountains, and eventually you have a higher arsenic level. So everybody looked at it totally differently. But it was just kind of weird to see this frantic state that people were put in, and they heard about the arsenic level, and then you find out the fire department really had a level of acceptance much higher than was accepted anywhere. So I think they ought to be looking at their standards.
All right, any last comments on the brownfield sites or the issues as a whole? Dan?
I wanted to correct something that I talked about last time.
Sure.
Possibly on the utility element on purple pipe. I know we brought that up, so that was like a unique thing, but I actually wanted to say, probably not purple pipe, but direct portable reuse. Turn a closed system to the water system so that it goes sewer to treatment back into a water system, as opposed to purple pipe as a thing instead. Because it seems like that's talking with more people in the last month. They say that's like a 10-year thing as opposed to having to build a purple pipe system over 30 years. So I think maybe more just a simple where you can figure some tickets at the other end and they're filtered out. And then, Diane mentioned under the circulation element about traffic control system, and we kind of just, like that said, and that was it. I wanted to kind of circle back to that and make that kind of should be absolutely a thing. We enhanced the traffic control system with fully synchronized clocks to right now to a fully computer controlled system, so we can direct public safety as well as rescues and emergencies. I think that's more of a solution to it, but the key issue is being able to actively get around town either in an emergency or during maybe holiday season, from 4th of July we can start moving traffic in different directions, but also to be able to readjust the streetlights from a computer control system as opposed to having to dial in on a 1975 modem and set the clock and change the time. So I think I wanted to bring that up a little bit more because I felt like we kind of glossed over it last time.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Okay, any other more general comments on the key issues? All right, so as I've mentioned previously, this is very good input. What we will do with this information is go back and essentially add to the issues where you had additions, delete things that you said to delete, add more substance to some that we felt were a little vague, and reorganize them. There's a few that we were going to introduce. I recall again the water quality one from our previous meeting. And then these will be presented in the draft general plan chapters as kind of an organizational principle. So as you go into, for example, these are probably not good examples because they're one issue elements, but if you went into the hazards element, you would see it organized around 3 key issues, and it'll likely say, here are the things that are addressed by state and federal policy, and then here are the things of local concern that have local policy addressing. And it would then break down these statements, flesh them out a bit more, and then present goals, policies, and programs to address them. So that's the beginning structure of the draft general plan itself.
Question,
Yes.
who and where and when do we do the, I'll call it the verbiage update of the existing issues? Like here, as an example, in the noise element, we talked about these developments and they cause noise, and they've already, like Meadowlark, already developed, Holly Secret, et cetera. When do we, who does the updating of that language?
The actual noise element itself, the whole.
No, anything where it pertains to something that was vital, 20 years ago, and is now passé. It's already, that word like Meadowlark is no longer a valid issue.
Yeah, we've, as you said, we've begun that process here with the issues. We carry that same process forward as we go into the policies. So we're going to go through the same process as we have done with the issues now with the goals and policies, where we're going to work with staff to sort of filter out all of the old stuff that's really not relevant anymore.
Right, that's what I'm wondering.
Do the consolidation. The issues themselves, as you sort of look through this document that Jennifer's given you, you're going to see a lot of overlapping and repetition that continues with the policies. And so we're going to work through those policies, for example, in some cases with task forces, where we have task forces. We've had discussion of, for example, biological resource policies and some of the natural resources policies with the biological resources task force that the city's appointed. So in those cases, we're working with those technical groups to ferret that out and bring to the GPAC a similar document that will have potentially updated goals and policies and programs organized with these issues, having scrubbed out a lot of the old overlapping stuff and introduced the new issues that we're talking about now. So I would anticipate a very parallel process to this one with goals and policies. And we're likely to begin that in January and work through it in the spring.
Thank you.
Okay, our next agenda item was GPAC questions on other matters from previous meetings. I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Yeah, that was all the stuff we did at the
We
beginning.
did at the beginning. Are there other just broader questions for the process or other planning matters within the city that the GPAC would like to?
I'm just wondering, how much latitude do we have? For instance, let's say the state takes on an issue and they study it and they accept a particular standard, and then Huntington Beach decides, well, that's not good enough. We think it ought to be more restrictive. What's the limit on that?
I think the answer to that question is complicated because I think it depends on the issue. There are areas of general plan law that are very far-reaching and very detailed. Housing, for example, is that way. There are areas of general plan law like open space and conservation where there's a bullet point list of things you have to address. How you address them is entirely up to you. And so the law itself varies on the level of detail that it requires of you. One of the other things that the state does, though, is that they also publish guidelines. So we have, and I think this is a good point to address some of the dialogue that we've been having. There's state law that essentially says the city shall do this. And it specifies the number of elements that we need to have and what's addressed in those elements. And as I said earlier, in housing, for example, it even goes on in some ways to tell you how to address it.
It doesn't tell you how enthusiastic you have to be to do it.
That's correct. Then you move from the law, and this is something the state does, this is something state government does on a variety of issues, not just planning. So then you move from the law to the guidelines, and we have a set of general plan guidelines. They were last updated in 2003 by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. They're currently being re-updated, and we're anticipating a new update to the general plan guidelines come January. The guidelines break down the law and say, here are some approaches you can take to address them. And I think it's important to consider the guidelines as just that. They're guidelines. But they're also the state saying, here are ways that we feel you should address the law. So I think that's a balancing act for the city. There are guidelines. You don't have to do them all. But there are things in those guidelines, for example, noise standards, where they suggest, here are some standards that are applicable in communities throughout California. I think what a lot of jurisdictions do is they take that and they paste it in their noise element and go on. I'm more of an advocate of saying, let's take that, let's evaluate it, let's look at our land use mix, let's see if it's appropriate for the community, and let's adjust it if we need to, because we can't. It's not a provision of state law that says you shall use this noise standard. So I think that's an important distinction, and we'll do our best as we go forward to illustrate for you when something's the law and when it's a guideline, to help us in those guidelines. Is that helpful? Does that answer your question? Okay, and if that's that, then we will move to public comments. I'm going to go to the back and grab the signage.
I have one right here.
Oh, thank you, John. All right, so we're going to do this a little bit differently tonight. What I would propose that we do is I'm going to go ahead and call the names of the people who've indicated they'd like to address the GPAC. We'll give you the time to do that. One thing that I would encourage the GPAC to do that's a little different than last time is let's take all of the public comments, and then we'll have a period for GPAC discussion to address those comments. I'd rather not do it comment, address the comment, address the comment. So I think it'll be more productive, because then you also have the benefit of hearing the full range of comments before you offer any response. Okay, is that acceptable to everybody? Yes. Okay, great. And then let's go ahead and begin, and let's start with Anthony Palumbo.
I didn't say I was going to speak.
Oh, sorry. You said no.
This is my first meeting, so I don't know what's going on.
Joseph Mastropolo. Oh, and you had the handout. Let me go ahead and take that. I'll make sure that everybody here gets one. Let me take some of
The handout is trying to address the question of traffic jams in Huntington Beach. And it's kind of a general question saying, are they planned or are they just occurring?
Can everybody hear?
Oh, we need some more over there.
Okay, if you come over here, I think everybody might be able to hear you. Is that right? Oh, no, I'm sorry. They can hear you around the handouts.
Here's another one, Dick.
Oh, there we go.
I'll bring it. Sure, I'll bring the extras back.
And that is a, excuse me, an introduction to the fact that an actual traffic study was done, and the results of the study indicate that traffic jams are already occurring in Huntington Beach. So the question is, to what extent has that been planned or not planned? And is there any plan in place to reverse the progression? Because the place where this study was done was a beginning of the place where new housing was taking place. So the purpose of the study was to test the subjective impression that the occupancy of 1,850 new apartments by thousands of new tenants in Huntington Beach will cause traffic jams. The method was to quantify traffic in an area of Huntington Beach with recent new construction and recent full occupancy. That area was near Bellaterra on Edinger, where 468 new apartments have been built and are fully occupied. Cars were counted from 10:50 to 11:50 each morning, Monday through Sunday. Traffic during rush hours is bound to be greater than the hours studied. So this, in effect, is an underestimation because it was late morning, it wasn't during rush hour. The results, the number of cars counted were 223, 219, 212, 228, 245, 285, and 290 from Monday through Sunday, respectively. Mean and standard deviation, 243 plus or minus 32 for 1 hour, or 4.1 cars per minute. This represented a threshold for traffic jams because 4.8 cars per minute yielded to traffic jams. So in the discussion, the additional traffic from 468 new apartments fully occupied yielded a threshold of traffic jams of 4.1 cars per minute. Traffic of 4.8 cars per minute was over that threshold for traffic jams and yielded 2 traffic jams. The occupancy of 1,382 additional new apartments over the 468 studied can be expected to increase traffic over the threshold for traffic jams. New construction and occupancy of that new construction needs to cease immediately to prevent the progression of new traffic jams to gridlock. The conclusion, an area near the 468 new apartments fully occupied was studied, yielded traffic of 243 plus or minus 32 cars per hour, 4.1 cars per minute. Traffic of 4.8 yielded 2 traffic jams. The occupancy of 1,382 additional new apartments over the 468 studied without remedy likely will cause a progression to gridlock. The traffic during rush hours is bound to be greater than the hours studied. So this, in fact, is an underestimation because it does not tell us anything about what it would be and is likely to be much greater during rush hours. Any questions on the study?
We'll take questions at the end of the comment period. Thank you. All right. Next up, question mark for Ron and Georgina Johnson. Would you like to address the GPAC?
No, thank you.
Okay. Also a question for Carrie Swan. Would you like to address the GPAC?
Yes, I would. I would just like to make one comment because this was part of the discussion as you were winding down in terms of what the state requirements are for general plan. As one citizen, my request to those serving on the committee and the consultant who is providing this service is that you create a plan that provides the absolute minimum required by the state and don't go one step further, because I personally have absolutely had it with government intrusion into my life. I already know that the city has a very intrusive set of plans for opening businesses, for building already, and so I prefer that if we are required to have a general plan by the state, we provide only the absolute minimum that's required, no more, and be out of our life. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol Woodward.
Yeah, I don't have a question.
Okay, thank you. Gino Bruno?
I'll pass. No, on second thought, I will not pass. I'm Gino Bruno, a longtime resident of the city of Huntington Beach. I don't really have a question, but I notice it says public comments. And let me comment by saying how disappointed I am in our city, specifically our planning department, more specifically PMC. What Jennifer failed to tell you in her update about what's happened since the last meeting of you folks, that was a city council meeting a couple of weeks ago. What she failed to tell you was the pushback from at least two of our city council members, Dave Sullivan and our mayor, having to do with the fact that the city is not interested in our comments, folks. Has that occurred to you? Pop-up workshops at Easter egg hunts? Come on. You're there with your kids and your grandkids, you're looking for Easter eggs. Somebody walks up to you and says, do you want to participate in a Huntington Beach General Plan update for the next 20 years? I guess so. So they start out, and I haven't seen these questions, but I'm going to find out what those questions were. How do you feel about clean beaches? Do you like clean beaches? I guess so. You like clean water? I guess so. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. When I asked Jennifer 2 weeks ago at that meeting, I said, I have not seen this meeting tonight on the city's website. She said, well, the agenda hasn't been prepared. Am I correct, Jennifer? Quote me, correct me if I misstated that. And so I would ask Jennifer tonight, when was this agenda prepared so that the meeting tonight could have been on the city's website? 4 p.m. this afternoon? I checked the city's website. Column on the right, meetings. Community Services Commission meeting, where? Next door. Time, 6 o'clock. This meeting, no mention. Maybe you have to dig down 4 or 5 or 6 levels on the website to find out that tonight there was going to be this GPAC meeting. And yet our city, our planning department says that they're really interested in our community feedback. Our community vision. This isn't City of Huntington Beach Residents Community Vision. This is the GPAC. I'm sorry, this is the PMC Community Vision. Don't be pulled around by your nose, by PMC. If they say the law says umpty-ump, you say to them, cite me the code section. And they're going to say, well, I don't have it at my fingertips. Fine, that's understandable. Email it to me tomorrow and copy every other member of GPAC. Don't let them get away with this. This has to be the Huntington Beach Community Vision. What I learned tonight, community vision is set in concrete. Oh, they're going to say, yeah, but the survey on the website remains open. Website, by the way, that opens up a whole new can of worms. What's the website address? hbnewwave.org or something. What is it? Nobody knows.
HBthenextwave.org.
There it is. HBthenextwave. Why couldn't they say HB General Plan Update.org? Why? They don't want you to remember that website. They don't want you taking that survey. They're not interested in what the residents have to say. Thank you.
Okay, I actually don't have any other indicated speakers. Are there any others who would like to address the GPAC this evening? And Matt, please.
First, I want to thank the GPAC for doing what you do. I understand taking your time out of your day, coming down here and doing the work you do on this. It's hard work. This is the first meeting I've been to, and honestly, I didn't see it on the website either. I was informed by Facebook that it was here. I was a little disturbed by one of the things on there, and that is the way we're handling environmental hazards, especially something called sea level rise. Now, if we're going to address in the general plan an idea of of how we recuperate from an incident of the sea level rising, I totally understand that. But it looks like you folks are being pulled into a direction that says we have to do something to try and mitigate the sea level from rising. Well, let me suggest there's really nothing you can do if the sea level is going to rise. Matter of fact, the sea level rose last week. I didn't see anybody out there with a solution to keeping it from rising. So if this general plan is about how do we handle that issue from a recovery standpoint, that's fine. But please, don't be drawn to the we need to do something to stop it from happening, because we can't. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else wishing to address the GPAC? I'd love to see your hands. Okay, if not, then I think we will move on to our next stage, which is to go ahead and adjourn. As Jennifer mentioned, we anticipate that this group will renew meetings in January, and at that time we will begin our discussion of goals and policies based on the key issues as well as potential alternatives. Ed?
Yeah, you're going to have a discussion or any comments
Oh,
that the
that's
GPAC
right.
might have to any of the public comments.
Thank you, my oversight. Let's go ahead and do that discussion. You've got a variety of different public comments. Any comments that the GPAC would like to offer in response to public comment?
Why don't you just go down the generalize what they were, and we can comment.
Okay,
I'd like
Chris,
to
you've got the
have
notes,
staff, I'd
right?
like to have staff comment also.
The first comment was in regard to the traffic study and in relation to traffic congestion.
Well, I would expect that maybe some staff member would have a comment, and that is that there is a good number of improvements that need to be made in the city, in different locations within the city in terms of traffic signals, left, right turn, left turns, and there's just a lot of improvements that have to be coordinated with the state. But I think they have a pretty good handle, that's my observation, on what the overall traffic, what the impact is. Now it's implementing the solutions. Am I right or wrong about that, Scott or Jennifer?
Yeah, no, you're right. In regards to the traffic study, which thank you very much for providing that, it's very similar to the way we address traffic on a planning level, both on a project-specific level and what we call program levels, where we look at traffic from, say, entire geographic areas, like a specific plan area. And for the general plan, we'll also be doing a traffic study for the general plan, which is what we call build out of the general plan and also the various alternatives. And we look at those very things. We look at what the existing traffic conditions are, what is the traffic when you add whatever it is that's being built, and we assess that impact. And sometimes the impact comes back that says, there's going to be a traffic problem here, and here's how you mitigate it. And sometimes that's improvements by widening the street, changing the street light patterns, and sometimes there is no mitigation for it. And all of that on a project by project basis goes before the planning commission, the city council, and it's the decision that has to be made. So we're very familiar with, just based on the projects that have occurred, including all of the projects that you mentioned, what improvements need to be done to the traffic and circulation network in the system in order to make it function at an acceptable level of service through time and through build out.
Yes, I'd like to address this question too. But first, a question for Scott. The Beach General Specific Plan started what year, and what year was it approved?
I think it started in 2008 and was approved, adopted in 2010.
Okay, so in that two-year period, you're addressing your traffic study on Edinger. That Beach Edinger specific plan was approved by the city council with significant and unavoidable impacts. And that they proved it. And in order to do that, they had to sign and vote on a statement of overriding considerations. So your city leaders knew that there were going to be a traffic jam there, but they decided for the good of, say, the economics or whatever reasons, they decided that that plan, even though there would be some impacts that were unavoidable, it should proceed. And that's what happened with the beach energy specific plan. And that's the way it is. And we just hope that the improvements that hopefully will be done to mitigate that will eventually come to fruition.
Let's not do it again.
Any other responses to the first comment? Mark?
Yeah, I have a question for staff. When the assessment of beach edge progress is going to be brought back to us in coming months, will there be any sort of traffic snapshot on how things are doing in the current evolution of the plan with how things were expected when the plan was enacted?
I think they're formally in the scope right now of what the extent of the traffic study will be, depending on what the extent of the changes are going to be. So part of that will, be assessing the traffic. Yeah. And part of the other issue with sometimes having to adopt an SOC, a statement of overriding considerations, like Ed was saying, is that if the city can't commit to implementing some of the improvements, for instance, some of the traffic impacts would require improvements at Beach Boulevard or on the 405 freeway at the on-ramps. The city can't commit that. So sometimes you have to, if you want to adopt, say, a project or approve a project, even though you know there will be an improvement to mitigate, like Ed said, you still would have to adopt the statement of overriding considerations because you don't have jurisdiction to implement that improvement on your own.
I think I'll just add one other thing too. Even though that council adopted a statement of overriding considerations, as Commissioner Bixby indicated, the city will be revisiting the traffic impacts. And if it's not done in the next year, certainly in the next 5 years. Plus there are improvements identified in the Beach Energy Corridor specific plan to Beach Boulevard that are anticipated to be done. And I know the city's looking at Maine and Ellis right now as an example. So even though that action was done in 2010, it doesn't mean that the city's turning its back to the traffic impacts. We're always analyzing, and also we analyze it with the circulation element.
Great. One last from Roy.
Yeah, Jeff, first of all, that whole bill of tariffs, I avoid that like the plague, especially on a Saturday or Sunday. I mean, when you look at, you have swap meets going on at Golden West College, when you have Costco, when you have a city within a city with all those apartments, which we found out at the last meeting, I believe it was, they planned 1.2 spot, 1.5 spots per unit for parking. You have Bella Terra itself, and then you have across the street. That's just insane. I mean, it absolutely is. Secondly, as far as traffic flow, and it was brought up about, want to make sure that traffic flow isn't such that it's going to impair medical situations or what have you, or emergency situations, excuse me. I'm more concerned just with day-to-day, making sure there's not a frustration. And I drive around the city a lot, and it just amazes me sometimes with, and I guess it's stupid little things, but it's like, now this is a left turn lane. We have 15 cars, and it goes off after 3. Why is that? Why do I have to sit here any longer than the people coming across here when their signal lasts 40 seconds or whatever, and mine lasts, a short period of time? I think that needs to be looked at. To me, it's just a frustration level. Why isn't, do it equitable? Obviously, if you have a little small street that's crossing Beach Boulevard, you want to keep Beach Boulevard going, and they have those synchronized. But I think there's a lot of other areas in the city where it baffles me why the lights aren't longer, get a larger group of cars through, and then the next group gets a chance to go. Because it's all that does to me, and I see it day in and day out, is it encourages the last two cars to run through a red light. And I see it all the time. They'll be sitting there and you're thinking, okay, it's going to be my turn. Oops, I missed that one. You wait. Signal comes on again. 3 more cars get through. And then there's 5. But the last 2 that got through, they're running red lights. And it just creates a bad situation for me, I think. But I think that is a concern that the city should definitely take in place. And I'm sure they have somebody that's in charge of that, but someone should be going around making sure that the signals are synchronized to get the maximum amount of flow you can for the streets, the capacity of those streets.
Is that done in the traffic element, the lights, or? Because I remember in commission one time, and Mark was on the commission too, we had a gentleman come up who has dealt with traffic, and he was talking about the arrow lights, that when it goes to a red, to a stop, that it's actually more dangerous because of those people running the lights, because they know they don't want to get stuck there, than a red to, you can turn on it again, and he brought that up in commission. I don't remember who he was. It was during a public comment. Have we studied that? Or is that in the traffic element? Is it the general plan? Where's that at?
We just study it like on a project by project basis.
But it's a citywide thing on the arrows, like he was mentioning.
That's something like our transportation division studies in public works.
If you have specific intersections you'd like us to look at, just email Jennifer and we'll make sure Public Works goes out there. I think
the guy made a good case when he came into that.
There were 3 or 4
thing.
intersections that had that issue, and so Public Works did go out and investigate. So,
is there a law or is there a policy that requires, some of them have been changed. They went from solid green to they put arrows in. And I think the reason was the way the sun comes up and the way the sun sets. So during about an hour of the day, it's kind of dangerous. I don't know that adding an arrow helps you any because you can't see. But, the example of the passive, green after you get the arrow, is there a law that says look after an accident or 2 or a death or whatever the heck it requires, you got to put in an arrow? Because we have slowed down traffic in areas, very specifically Slater and Edwards as an example, because they put an arrow in. I assume because of an accident. But 90% of the time, I'd say probably 95% of the time, the sun is not rising and or setting, which means it's in your eyeballs. That's when you have the cross-traffic issues. And I'm seeing it kick in more often. It's happening at Golden West, at Slater, it's happening at different areas. So I'm wondering whether there's a law that has required us to put these arrows in because of accidents. And it kills flow. So do you guys happen to know if that's what drives it?
Yeah, I think we can take that as a follow-up question for the next meeting, just like we had for this meeting. So we'll take that question down and bring that answer back for the next meeting.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot later, so.
I just think you cut down on the possibility of those people running. If I know that, okay, I didn't make it, but it's going to be green, and then I make my left-hand turn lane when it's safe to do so, people aren't inclined to run like they are.
Like on Edwards and Warner.
Yeah.
It stops, and then you get the light after.
And then you go, okay, you're not worried about it. I just think by not having those, people are going to run it, and that's how you get those accidents.
There's a point in the handout that says that this is progressive, and that is that the construction has not been completed yet. This was only about a portion that was occupied, completed and occupied. And there is a greater portion, much greater portion, that is unoccupied and is under construction. And so the comments about we're going to look into this and we may have to grit our teeth with some unpleasant traffic circumstances, that is essentially an admission that these new traffic circumstances are going to be much greater than the ones that we have now. This is a progressive problem. If that construction is not stopped, and I don't see that there's any sign of that happening, if it's not stopped, then this is going to be a progressive thing. And what this report is suggesting is that the ultimate end of it, if in fact it continues, is gridlock. Now, is that what the city wants?
Thank you for your comment. We really need to limit this at this point to the GPAC discussion. And we're going to continue that way with the responses to the other questions as well. Chris,
Why?
Because we had a format.
Because PMC tells us it's that way?
No, because we had established a format for public comment.
You established before.
We agreed to it.
And the GPAC agreed to it.
Can I make a suggestion? I brought it up at the last meeting. I do think that when these issues come up, I mean, it's not that often the city has an opportunity to hear what the public really is concerned about. And I think we should at least be making a notation of it and advising the city council that these issues, although they were not appropriate to be considered in the general plan, we feel that they're appropriate enough to be passed on to the council for their action. And it's somehow or other, whether staff compiles that report or it's a part of your report, I think we should, when we walk away after we've heard a lot of things that we know aren't related to what we're here for, I think it'd be a shame if it just was dropped at that point.
And I agree with you. I think that's a good suggestion. Maybe what we could do is, as we do these exchanges with the GPAC on the issues that are not necessarily directly related to the general plan, and as staff brings back the answers to those at subsequent meetings, those answers can also be shared with council, at which point they see both the question and the response.
I mean, you don't even really have to answer them as long as it gets up to the city council that we think it's significant enough that they should somehow or other pursue answers to these questions.
Absolutely. And I do believe council's getting copies of the agendas, the minutes,
Is council getting public comment too?
Yeah, they're in the meeting summaries as well.
Okay.
Right, the comments are in the meeting summaries along with any.
We periodically send like a package to council, but also once we finish them, this meeting summaries, they go on the general plan update website. So you can see like the last meeting's meeting summary. Is it up yet?
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah, it's up on the website. But yeah, we can also.
I think it'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. Okay, the second comment, Chris?
Speaker 2 requested that the general plan only contain those items that are an absolute state law minimum.
Okay, thank you. Comments from the GPAC or any discussion?
I agree.
Right.
I think it's simple as possible.
I think we had decided that last
I think we
time.
decided that last time too.
That's
Little
the
as we do.
implementing policies. That's the enthusiasm that
Okay. Next comment, Chris?
Speaker 3 had questions about the access to the agenda and questions about the about this process.
Yeah, I think for 58,000 for public research or public outreach, we should be notifying the public. For 58,000, you could do a lot. And that, according to your budget, is what you're putting in for that. So we need to make it as accessible as possible to everyone. And make sure those meetings are up. Even if it's not an agenda that they can pull, at least say there's a meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to jump on the bandwagon here, but I do think that we said that we were going to make it easier to find this on the city website and put a link or something on the front page so that you can get to this hpthenextwave.org, make it a little easier to find, number one. And number two is, I was waiting for this to see how it was going to be introduced, the comments from city council and what they said about the selection process of the people, like, how many people participated in the survey. And I really didn't hear anything about that, if you were going to change it or not, or I thought that you would address that, because, I kind of waiting for it to come up, but since it's come up at the end, if the people want to know, is there any plan to get a larger selection of people, or are we kind of done? I mean, if you get more pop-ups, you get more pop-ups. I mean, are you going to do any canvassing or anything to increase is this the selection that we do, or I don't know?
No, we've heard a lot of feedback at the council level, the GPAC level. We've had discussions at the staff level as well regarding what to do the next time we're kind of going out for a broad push of public engagement. And that's going to occur as we enter that next phase where we start talking about the goals and the policies and potential alternatives. And I mean, I will say all of the tools that you've mentioned are available to us. We will continue to use a survey. We think that's something that's worked effectively, and it seems to be something in general agreement that, you know, that's an effective way to reach.
I agree, it's just that, I think the public, from what I'm talking to the people in my neighborhood, they don't really know what the general plan is. Really, and, you know, I think it just needs to be out there.
And we will also continue to do mailers. There was a water bill mailer that went out to the beginning of the process. We'll evaluate how effective that was and adjust that if we need to in order to reach more people through mailers. We'll definitely do an additional push on the website for more interactive activities at a website level and notification of meetings. Email blasts and that type of information in order to get the information out.
One thing, have you given any consideration to like a Facebook page? You know, a lot of people do that. The Facebook department has one or something, I mean, something like that.
We did it for these ones, and then we have our public information officer, prior, like a couple of times prior to the meeting, do what's called a boost.
What is it, for the general plan update?
Which costs money, yeah. So it's for all the events that we did. Every event that we did, she would do several boosts.
But it's not cryptic like the next way, you know, I mean, you gotta.
No, it's the city's Facebook page
Okay.
and Twitter account.
So I think somebody actually brought up a very good point in making the opposite point, which was a lot of residents aren't, I mean, based on some city council meetings, people don't get involved until the trees get taken out in front of their house or, you know, bulldozers show up. And this is a pretty common thing. And unless you're this type of nerd, this is not something that's going to be interested to you if the city has a booth somewhere or to send you a water bill. I mean, the last meeting somebody brought up said, oh, it was in my water bill, and then I just forgot about it. Well, we're spending money to mail this out. And some of the concerns are we're spending money to do this project, but now you're asking to do more outreach, which is going to cost more money. So there's a little bit of circular argument there that I'm trying to kind of square the circle on, is that how are we going to get people involved? But I mean, we're not going to knock on everybody's door and say, hi.
I understand.
We're doing a general plan update. Here's a 500-page document. Read this and come back with really quantitative questions.
I agree, but I mean, is this what typically other cities do?
Yes, it is. It's a combination of surveys and the pop-up activities, the fairs, festivals, GPAC meetings, workshops, and a variety of different tools like that. I mean, honestly, to be successful at this, you have to get it from a variety of different angles. It can't all be GPAC meetings. It can't all be workshops at City Hall, at the Senior Center. There should be some out in the community at large. And in some degree, catching people in what they do. Because that's the way to get diverse input that's broader than just the people who come to meetings.
And what do you make the statement that a lot of the questions about the surveys and then who the participants were that were interviewed during the process, and a lot of those people represented enormous groups of people. In the chamber representatives, there was people from different environmental organizations, different business organizations, people from different corporations within the city, and they represent, as their liaison or just their president of their organization, big groups of people that make policy decisions or that have a say in the city. So to say that we interviewed 600 people, or we talked to 600 people, or we talked to 25 people, I mean, I think that's not a proper sample in the statistical sense, but I think it really kind of got some of the vibe. And I mean, granted, there are some other groups that can be fully addressed now that have come out. That have discovered this ordinance, I put discovered quotes, but have decided to start attending these meetings, which I think is great. The public input is awesome, but to do that in a constructive way that can help affect the change that they want, I think is the better way to attempt that. And then during the next interview process, to be able to probably check off a couple of if they have leaders of those groups, or at least take some surveys, because I do not. Some of the credence in, well, we had a Facebook survey. Well, say Facebook survey is going to be self-selective of the organization of which you are a member. So presenting that as something that may or may not be relevant, I don't know, I think it may contradict the previous point I made, but either way, I think it's aggregating that input, weighting it based on the bias on that input, based on the self-selected group of people, I think can help out the process, or at least the presentation of the process that we're trying to get people involved in this. And I think that we are trying to get people involved. I mean, short of knocking on doors or banging people over the head and saying, this is so interesting, absolutely, let's paint the tents together, everybody, it's gonna be so much fun, we're all gonna do this. I don't think, I think it's gonna be difficult to get people involved.
I went back here and I'll come back to you, Mark.
So can I just generally ask that, I think the one comment was that they weren't aware of the meeting. I don't think you need an agenda to know the meeting's at 6 o'clock on Wednesday, Thursday, whatever the date is. So could we at least commit to, maybe a link on the front page for meetings, whether the website's cryptic or not, just a hyperlink will take you to the right spot, and then just the date of the next meeting, regardless of agenda, just so that it's just easier.
Yeah, no,
of course, if there's never an agenda, you show up and you'll get there. I didn't know what the agenda is going on here.
We'll look into that. We'll also look at, if HB GP update or something, if we can use that link too. I mean, we can try to create a couple other ones. These are great suggestions, and any feedback you guys have, we're certainly open to that. And we are in the process of updating the website. So, yeah, we had hoped to have it done by this week, but it's taking a little bit longer than we had anticipated.
Polling multiple websites to keep in touch with what's going on in the city really sucks, and it's a poor way to stay informed. Is it possible to enhance the Next Wave website to allow people to register their email addresses to get on an agenda distribution list? Say, just tell me every agenda in the process, you register once, you get all the notifications in advance.
It's a very good suggestion. We do have an email register that's set up through that website, and what we can do is essentially when the agendas are available, they should be able to go out to that list. I think that's something we could certainly do. Roy?
And Mark makes a very good point there, so did Dan, about the fact that, I've probably talked to 20 people, that said, I heard you serving on this committee. And as soon as I start talking, it's, So that being said, I think, we need to make sure that that the people that really do care, the people that showed up here tonight, that the people that really do care, that we make sure that they're aware of what's taking place. Because the fact of the matter is, and a lot of these people I'm with, they're ex-educators or current educators, and they just kind of look at it like, I'm glad you're doing that, because I don't want to spend my nights down there. But the thing that's I think even more alarming was Mr. Bruno saying that, the city doesn't care about the public comments. Obviously, that's his personal feeling about it, but if that is the case, then we have a real problem, because they're supposed to be reflective of the community and the needs and projects or anything else like that. So again, that's just one individual's personal comment and view on it, but if that is not just an individual point of view, but by thousands of residents of Huntington Beach, that's a problem. And I'm sure it goes on no matter where you go. I was with the school district, and you heard that in the public meetings, with the school board members, that now they don't really care. They have their own agenda, and they're going to do this and that and what have you. But I think it is important that the city is receptive to what's being said and what the community thinks.
Any other comments? Okay, the next comment, Chris?
You got two comments over here that want to speak.
No, I just wanted to mention that this is the first time I've been here, but I can tell you right now, first of all, finding out about the meeting was a difficulty, and I can tell you for a fact that none of my neighbors know about it. Now, I'll try to pass the word along, but to be effective at telling the citizens this even exists is, I gotta give you a fat zero, because, like I said, I happen to find out because I heard something about it, and I thought it was last night, but then I stumbled across the actual information, but I didn't get it from their website. Is the survey still open? Because I will.
The survey is still open.
Okay, so we'll take it.
I'll come back to you after we take the next round of comments. Chris, the next comment. Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I think maybe one way to expand is to notify organizations such as service clubs, maybe homeowner associations, and get the word out that way, and you can't notify everyone. And people always say, well, I didn't know if I needed to send a notice. Well, even if you got a notice to their house, they aren't going to pay attention. But maybe if it goes to an organization and they express the importance of it to their membership, maybe they will do something.
Yeah, Dick, we did, for the first phase, we did a letter to, I can't remember all the organizations, but
Yeah.
a lot of organizations.
Yeah.
And offered to do, like,
Go there.
to go there. Yeah, we didn't get much response from it, but this next phase, we're gonna add HOAs to it too, so we think we'll get better response from HOAs. But it is a lot of word of mouth too, which is great, since Mike's group's been involved. My phone rings more about this project than it did for the first 4 months, and it's great, because nothing is better than talking one-on-one with somebody. So if I can spend 10 to 15 minutes, which I have, and then that person knows more about it, knows where to look for things, and they tell their neighborhood or their group, that's sometimes the best way things get out. But we will continue to search for different avenues and try to get as much feedback as we can, because we do care, we do love it. And it's the only way to hear things, so.
And the whole general plan update is a 1.5-year process, so as you know, the final document, what is formulated with your recommendations and planning commission's recommendations, it goes to city council. There'll be numerous public meetings regarding the final document, so it won't be till 2016 that then.
Is anything being done on Channel 3?
Yeah, she puts up a slide, we gave her a slide, and when I say she and her, it's Julie, our PIO. But she will put up a slide, this was for the first phase, and it'll just say, I think it has the website, it's been a while. And so she was running that pretty regularly. We have for the next phase, we're gonna try to do a bigger, promo video that will run.
Yeah, I think that would help.
Yeah, so we're gonna try to do that, and actually we're gonna try to do that on HBTV and YouTube, because I think that'll get a lot more people to it.
Okay, next one. Speaker 4 noted that if we're going to address changing coastline in the general plan, should focus on recuperating from sea level rise impacts, but not on mitigating the sea level from actually rising itself.
Well, I think in a roundabout way, that's what eventually came out of that when we discussed it earlier. Because anything less than building a 15-foot wall or whatever along there, I know you can't prevent it unless you're also going to help with what's going on in the atmosphere that's causing global warming, that's melting, all the ice caps, that the whole thing is pretty damn complicated. So I was assuming that we're not talking about how do we stop sea level from rising, but more what do we do, and if we have the El Niños like we have, which I was referring to, with, we all lived through those. And I think one of them was about 5 years apart or 6 years apart there. We
got 2 new piers out of that.
Yeah, we got, and a new restaurant too. But I mean,
it's economic development right there.
but you're right. I mean, the Pacific Coast Highway is closed for a period of time. I mean, that's a huge artery. You're going to have to go, wander all the way up and loop around. So to me, I assume that when you talk about that, I don't think this is something. I hope it's not a global warming alarmist or something. We know that, oh my God, this is all happening. But it's more about, we know it's going to happen. It's happened before. This is what we had to live through. Now let's take preventative measures. What can we do efficiently and the fastest way we can to pump the water out and to try and get everything back to normal. So I assume, and I believe I heard that, but it was, we can't stop the sea from rising unless we put in 16 Poseidons right out here, sucking all that seawater in, and that takes care of the rising water.
I mean, and you are correct. When we're talking about sea level rise in this context, we're talking mitigation. So I mean, this is about prudent planning for mitigation. Saying, what's the best information we have? Take it, accept it, recognize its faults, but use it for planning. and saying, what is it that we can do to mitigate the exposure that we have?
And it's the same thing when you talk about the tsunami.
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
the same thing.
two things, is put signs up there and then make sure everybody's in pretty good shape so they can run like hell. And hopefully they understand run inland, don't run.
Some of them.
To watch all the water getting sucked out, you know, and, oh, that's interesting. But I mean, there's not much we can do about that either, other than just try and make sure we get people going in the proper direction.
Kay, I did want to come back to your comments.
Yeah, I appreciate you letting me slip in. If I hadn't come here tonight, I would not have heard the term statement of overriding conditions. The topic of the new apartments along the beach and along Edinger has been defended, that this was adopted by the previous council, and if you weren't there to participate, well, that's too bad, making it important to be here now. But now what I'm finding out, and correct me if I'm wrong, you go through this exercise of amending and adopting a new general plan. Then there are specific plans that need to be adopted to implement various phases of it. Staff, such as Public Works, Engineering, will come up with information that says, hey, if you do this, you have a big problem. And now what my understanding is, a majority of the council can adopt a statement of overriding conditions. Is that accurate? Is that what happened? Because that's what approved the apartments that Joseph went to study with these 1.5 cars per unit that are going to be belching out onto Beach Boulevard and out onto Edinger. So the staff already knew that this was going to happen, but a majority of the council adopted this by a statement of overriding conditions. I would certainly hope that this committee will make a point of addressing that and make sure that the general public is aware that these are what the elected representatives can do. All this time and money spent on planning, all the time and money spent on staff doing the work to come up with information that's going to tell you, yes, if you do this, this is your problem, can be ignored by a majority of the city council adopting a statement of overriding conditions.
Considerations, sir. That's word is consideration.
Thank you.
So, I'd like to make a comment. The problem I see is that you see this all the time. Right? Someone watches a news article, they see somebody did something, and they make a judgment call. There's numerous facts that go into a decision. I wasn't there. I would also question, hey, you got all these apartments, there's a lot of traffic, and I think we can all agree the traffic is not a good thing, period. But I don't believe this decision was made on traffic, because there's not a moron in the world to go, great, we're going to have a lot of traffic, let's build apartments. There's multiple data points, and I'm just asking people to look outside the box. There are second and third order effects of any decision. This is obviously a second order effect. It says, hey, you get traffic. You also get a lot of tax revenue. You also get a lot of people come to your city. You get a lot of things that occur. And because you have those things, you have more police officers, and you have more this, and you have more that. So, yes, you pay the price of traffic, and I'm assuming the reason they wrote this overwhelming consideration, or whatever, overriding consideration, is because of the multiple factors, of which one negative is traffic. There must be significant positives, and I think we can think of a few of them. I don't know if they override traffic or not, but they're there. And to judge a decision somebody made because they had more data than we're talking about in this room, it's a little unfair. So I wasn't there. I'm not going to defend it because I deal with the traffic as well. I believe I'm going to get some of the benefits of them building those apartments. I don't know what it all is, probably the tax dollars, but I'll get it back.
Yeah, so the start of the last comment raised an interesting question in my mind. The existing specific plans were written to be consistent with the general plan as it existed at the time the specific plans were done. What happens if this new general plan goes in new directions where we're no longer quite as consistent with the underlying specific plans? Are we creating any obligation to refresh those underlying specific plans?
You kind of are. If the policies, if the issues and the policies that the GPAC identifies and that ultimately say if they got adopted through the general plan process say something that's contrary to these specific plans that have been adopted since the last general plan, then maybe one of the actions, the implementation programs, is to go back and look at those specific plans and change them so that they match the vision and the policies of the new updated general plan.
But that's a conscious decision in the general plan process, understanding that cost. That, I mean, I think that's the critical point is, when we talk about land uses, we'll be bringing in the specific plan says it should be this. The GPAC may discuss and say, well, maybe it should be that. If that's ultimately the way the general plan goes, that's part of the dialogue, which is one of the increased costs of making that decision could affect the existing specific plan and the need to bring it into conformance.
Sure. I'd like to just point out that all that's true, but it's also an oversimplification of the process. You also have a traffic engineer, an expensive traffic report that's done. It identifies what the impacts are, what you have to do to fix it, what it's going to cost to fix it. There's a traffic impact fee associated with that, and there's a timeline, and there's also cooperation with, in this case, we have Beach Boulevard and Pacific Coast Highway that are both state highways, and you pretty well are bound by what the state is willing or unwilling to do. But Edinger Avenue and Warner Avenue, if it just so happens that every one of those choke points is at a state highway, and they have other considerations. So, but it's not like, oh yeah, we'll just adopt these overriding considerations and that'll get us off the hook. You still have financial obligations to fix these deficiencies. Just word for our sponsor. For my sponsor.
Any last comments from anybody? All right, hearing none, we will very much look forward to seeing you all again in January. You'll receive a notice from Jennifer regarding the meeting date and time. We'll probably take a poll of the GPAC members to find a date that works since we approach January. At which point then we'll prepare the agenda and make it available via all of the various different email lists that we have and an improved website. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time this evening. I appreciate it.